Welcome to the Alice Paul Center podcast series, bringing you the latest in gender, sexuality, and queer scholarship and practice.
I'm Ann Esakove of the Alice Paul Center, and I'm here with Lauren Jade Martin, Associate Professor of Sociology and Coordinator of the Women's Studies minor at Penn State Berks, and this year's Alice Paul Center's Visiting Scholar. So in addition to her scholarship on the sociology of reproduction, which is an area that's really close to my heart, Lauren is also an activist and an advocate. And I'm hoping we could talk a little bit about how those different roles overlap and where they don't overlap. So welcome, Lauren.
Hi.
Thanks for being with us today. I thought that we could start by clarifying for folks what you mean by reproductive justice and how that might differ from a reproductive rights framework that people are more familiar with. And then also how you came to focus on reproductive justice in your scholarship.
Sure. I think when people think about the term reproductive rights, they immediately go to abortion and maybe secondarily to birth control and the fight for women to get access to those and the legalization of both contraception and abortion. But to me, reproductive justice goes beyond just fighting for the right to limit how many children you have, which is really the focus of abortion and contraception, but also includes the right to have children, the right to raise your child in a healthy, supportive environment. So it's much broader than just getting access to abortion and birth control, but there's also things like welfare rights and having fighting to eliminate restrictions that try to push women not to have children, particularly poor women and women of color and immigrant women.
Can you give us some examples of some of the policies and other ways that women are discouraged not to be having children?
Sure. So we could look at policies around welfare that existed, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and somewhat into the 2000s, that really put limits on the number of children that poor women could have if they were on welfare, attempts to, even really creepy attempts to send children to orphanages, things that were in the in Charles Murray's work, Losing Ground, that was then adopted in the contract with America that then subsequently wound up in the welfare reform package. The orphanages part didn't happen, but some of the caps on how many children that women could have were put there. Or there were battles in the 60s and 70s around sterilization, where poor women of color were being sterilized without their consent or sometimes without their knowledge. And that happened at the same time that white middle-class women were often struggling to have the right to get sterilized. So you saw this real conflict between these two different populations. And only one was framed as a reproductive rights issue, but reproductive justice would encapsulate both sides of that story.
I see. And I think about now with the increase in incarceration of women,
Yes,
right?
definitely.
And then how quickly they move to remove their children from them.
Right,
Yeah.
or incarcerated women who have children giving birth while shackled would be another huge matter of reproductive justice or injustice.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And then how did you come to really focus on reproductive justice in your scholarship?
It really started as an undergrad. So when I was an undergrad at Bard College, I was a major in sociology, and I also concentrated in ethnic studies and gender studies. So I was trying to think about a topic that would cover all these interests of mine, and I came across the ideas of reproductive rights. At that time, I wasn't even aware of the term reproductive justice. It had just been, Sister Song had just been started to talk about it, but I wasn't aware of it yet as an undergrad. So I just was really interested in the history of it, and a professor of mine let me know about Dorothy Roberts' book, Killing the Black Body, and that really blew my mind away.
Of course, yeah.
And the other works by Angela Davis and other amazing women of color writers and activists. So that's really how I got interested in the topic of reproductive justice.
Right. And then how does your current work that's looking at reproductive technologies fit into this reproductive justice framework?
That is something I'm struggling to figure out where exactly it does fit. Because on the one hand, when you think about reproductive technologies, a lot of it's really expensive and it's really inaccessible. And right now, the only people who tend to have access to it are people with money and resources and really good insurance plans, or who happen to live in countries or states where there is some policy where healthcare has to go towards things like infertility treatment or in vitro fertilization. But if you are a poor woman or even just a regular middle-class woman without a super insurance plan, you don't really have access to it. So one question I have is it a reproductive justice matter to not have access to some technologies like infertility treatment, even ones that go so far as egg donation or surrogacy? And that's where it gets really complicated in my mind, because I tend to think about reproductive justice being about autonomy and bodily integrity, right? And so having the right to have a child or not have a child and being supported in that, right? But then when we talk about using another person's body or body parts, that's where, to me, it gets really complicated, right? If we think about gay men in the United States, what access do they have to have kids, or gay men throughout the world? They might be living in a state or a country where it's difficult to adopt. Is it a reproductive justice matter for them to contract with a woman typically poorer than them to have a baby for them? That's where I get really stuck in this really murky area where I'm trying to draw the line between, well, is this a reproductive justice matter, and whose body are we talking about? Is it the reproductive justice of the surrogate or the egg donor or the person contracting with them for the baby?
Yeah, and that really makes, to my mind, this kind of stark reality that I think that we often don't think about when we think about reproductive justice, which is it's all relational. It's all in an interaction. When we think about it, even with a justice framework, often as the individual, but reproduction is never solely about an individual.
Right. It's about the collective and the society.
Right. Yeah. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I wanted to ask you, so I know that you have an interest in bridging academia and practice, particularly given your background working for social justice. And we've had conversations about how difficult that really is to do in the academy. So I want to ask you about it, hopefully in a slightly different way. And so I was wondering, do you find that your intellectual work influences your activism? And if it does, in what ways does it do that?
I would say it does. I have, with a caveat that being in academia, I've been much less active than I used to be. So that's just one of the things that happens, or at least happened to me, is that once I started focusing on publishing and getting tenure and presenting my work, I just had less time to do activist work, and some of my interests also shifted. So a lot of my activist work was not on reproduction, but it was on domestic and sexual violence. So I worked for shelters, and I volunteered, and I did consulting, and I worked for with different ad hoc groups on this issue. And then intellectually, it was really hard for me to continue that on an intellectual level, because I was just really burnt out on that sort of work. In terms of reproductive rights, some activism as far as, it's hardly even donating money to causes. In Berks County, I was part of a Planned Parenthood council, and we tried to do some work there. But it's really, to me, I find it really hard, and I wish I could do more, and I probably could do more. Yeah.
But and like I said, we've talked about this, that academia is, I'm not even sure what word I want to use, but it's set up in a way that so removes us from the practical aspects of the work that we do, and when the work we do is about such important, pressing social issues right now.
Right, it's not valued. It wouldn't. If I had maintained my level of activism, that wouldn't have counted in my tenure dossier, right? That wouldn't count. Doesn't really count for anything,
right?
It's how many publications do I have? What are my teaching evaluations like? How much service am I doing within my college? I mean, there's some credit towards community work, but then what types of community work gets valued? If I had start blogging, or have Twitter campaigns, is that going to count as much as a publication in a peer-reviewed, highly ranked journal?
Absolutely not.
No, it's not going to count.
Yeah. Well, do you find that your activist background informs the scholarship that you do, right?
I would say it does. I mean, I think I mean, just the intersectional approach that I take, that I learned from doing activism, and from, even as an undergrad, learning from reading Dorothy Roberts' book, and just taking that approach and understanding things from a less of a narrow perspective, just trying to think about, well, how does this actually affect people with these various intersecting identities? Obviously, race is going to play a role, and gender, compounded by class and immigration status. So I would say that, yeah, it's definitely had an impact.
Yeah, right. And so one thing that I noticed is that at the beginning of the year, you made a PDF of your 1999 zine, Who is Fit to be a Mother, available on WordPress and on your blog, and we'll link to those resources in our resource guide. So will you tell me a bit about the zine and why you decided to make it available again?
Sure. So again, it was an undergrad. My thesis was about, now I would say it was about reproductive justice, but then I was just called it reproductive freedom. And it was really looking at sort of the history of the reproductive rights movement in the United States and how that intersected with other movements of Black power and civil rights. And thinking about the way that reproduction became this tool of social control, but also this tool of liberation and freedom. And so I had made a zine out of it after I graduated from college. So it was a 8.5 by 11 folded, multi-page, little photocopied magazine. And I wrote it in the style of women's liberation pamphlets, which I've always been fascinated by the imagery. And I took a lot of imagery from those. Maybe there might have been some pictures from our bodies ourselves and other, handouts that I'd found along the way. And I wanted to make it a zine because the thesis that I wrote was very, even though it was an undergrad thesis, it was very academic. So I wanted to have something, I did all this work and I wanted people to read it because I thought what I wrote was something that people should know about this history that existed. And so I did that, and that was available for a little while in the early 2000s. And then recently I was just looking back at it and I was like, this was a reproductive justice zine from, it was either 1999 or 2000. I was like, wouldn't it be great if this could be out in the world again? I must have the original somewhere, maybe my parents' house, I'm not sure. Yeah. But I did find one copy of it. Well, and I was like, let me just scan this and put it out there. And when I originally published it in the late 90s or early 2000s, I made sure that people could copy it and, for free and just pass it around if they wanted to. And so I wanted to put it on my website so people could just download it and still continue to pass it around.
Yeah. And then when you looked at this, right, almost close to 20 years later, were you struck by similarities, differences of where we are now from when we were there?
Oh, that's interesting. I would say the similarities would be some of the fault lines of women's activism and women's movements and organizations today. That a lot of what I saw in my original thesis from the 90s was how there were lots of splits among feminist organizations based on race and class and sexual orientation, and we definitely still see that today. If we think about all the controversy around the Women's March. We definitely still see some of the fault lines they're still there. We just keep playing the same situation over and over again and not really learning from the past.
So you talked a little bit about why you made a zine for this based on your thesis, but you've done other zines. And so the Alice Paul Center, last year we put out our first zine, and we're going to do another one this year. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what's the appeal of zines? What are you doing with that you're not able to do through, people think about now you could blog and you can tweet and you can have all these other ways of getting information out, but a zine is, traditionally it's not online, it's paper and you hold it in your hand and it's, with staples and the whole, really visceral. So
yeah, when I started making zines in high school, there wasn't, there's America Online, but there wasn't blogs didn't exist. That whole digital world didn't exist, and zines were a way to really get my voice out. And I could still see today the value of that. And the same thing with blogging, I would think. Compared with academic publishing, where you it's very formal, you go through this really long review process, you might not get published in the end, it's copy copy edited. It's very academic. But a zine is you could put anything in there. It's you. The only editor is you. You could show it to other people to get help copy editing it. But it's really about anyone can publish it as long as you have access to a copy machine and a typewriter or even just a pen and paper. Or if you want to go digital, you could do it that way as well. And I do think there's still power in the paper, which is why I made the PDF, but I hope people download the zine so they actually have it on paper closer to the original intent of it.
It's a really exciting zine, and so I encourage people to take a look.
Thank you.
So one of the many events you're participating in while you're here at Penn is the GSWS Pedagogy Seminar, and you're going to be participating in the one on managing identity-based conflict in the classroom. So I was hoping that you can give us a little preview of what you see as some of the key challenges and strategies for managing identity-based conflict.
Sure. I think it is definitely a challenge in a college classroom or even beyond that. I mean, before I went into academia, I worked for domestic violence organizations, and my focus was on doing community education. So I was working with a lot of community groups in high schools and junior highs. In any sort of public forum, people are coming there with their own identities and their own issues, and people don't always see eye to eye. So when you are the teacher or the workshop presenter or the facilitator, you're there to help create a supportive environment where people get their voices heard, but also respect other people. So it can be complicated, right? Because one person's truth may be offensive to another person's values. So how do you balance that? And what I found is that when things are really hot, you don't shut down the conversation, but you try to take it down a notch, right? I might try to get students to, okay, let's write, right? Let's take a couple minutes to just write down what we're feeling, instead of people just talking at each other or past each other. So really try to slow things down and try to figure out what is it that's going on here, and using respectful language and making sure that it's an environment where even if students don't know what terminology to use, just creating a space where people can be a little brave and courageous in using terminology that they might be brand new to them, right? Do they know what cisgender is? Do they know what trans is? If they don't, okay, let's talk about it. Let's just make a space where we can really talk about what do these various terms mean, right? And why are some terms not okay? Why were they okay 5 years ago, but not now? And just make a space where that's okay.
Right. And so we're going to have to cut here because I have a question and I haven't figured out what it is exactly, because you gave some examples, but so I want to go back to what you were just saying about that some people's truth is offensive to other people, and that really fits with your theme around free speech and safe space, right? And trying to complicate those as not being, mutually exclusive, right? And in opposition to each other. And so, I mean, you gave us a couple of examples of ways to kind of de-escalate, but really, how do you see that tension playing out in the classroom, and really as educators, how we can either really use that as a pedagogical tool, almost, that tension, that problem.
Yeah. Well, I work in Berks County, Pennsylvania, which is an interesting place. And I have a lot of students who are local, but I also have a lot of students from Philly and beyond. So sometimes students are coming from lots of different places. And one example I would say, and this was before same-sex marriage became legal in all 50 states, sometimes my students would want to debate the merits of same-sex marriage. And I remember having one student who was just really, really opposed to it. And the other students, the majority of the students in the classroom just really immediately jumped on him. For how could you think this, blah, blah, blah. Just something, okay, hold on, just sort of let's slow down, let's hear what he has to say, but then allowing the other students really to, I don't want to not take charge, but really have the opportunity to talk about it in the classroom in a way that wasn't going to be hurtful or offensive to other students in the classroom. But instead of me just, there might be a tendency to try to shut down that conversation or to just tell that student, no, you're wrong, but really allowing other students to take the lead on trying to educate the student who turns out at the end of the semester was like, I've thought about this, like maybe you guys are right. And it's, he was allowed to have his opinion. He was a very conservative Christian student, and that was fine. In other cases, it hasn't necessarily gone so well. So, or I've not known how to deal with it. So during the 2016 run up to the election, I did have one student who wore his MAGA hat. Very, very nice, quiet student. No one ever addressed it. I never addressed it. The other students recognized it. It was just sort of this thing that sat there in the classroom, and I still don't know if that was the correct tack to take, to just not make a big deal of it, right? Because the students knew that some students were pro-Trump and some students were anti-Trump. Did I want to make a big deal of it? The class was not about that at all, not about politics. So that's one place where I'm like, I don't know that I handled that correctly by just not ever going there, not telling him, other students wear hats. I wasn't going to tell him to take his hat off if the other students couldn't take their hat off. But, at the day after the election, when we had class and a lot of people, including myself, were incredibly upset, he was just sort of oblivious, and still wore his hat. And, you could see the tension in the room that day. But, yeah, I still don't know how one should have dealt with that situation of the MAGA hat in the classroom.
Right. And really that is such a tough situation because, as you said, it wasn't the topic of the class. It wasn't, other people probably had other kinds of things that had to do with the election, and do you call out a student?
Right.
When that's, because then you start moving toward censorship.
Right. He had the right to wear that hat. Yeah. Unless there was a policy of no hats at all. Right. I'm not going to tell him to take off your hat. And he, again, I think was genuinely unaware of the impact that his hat was having. And maybe I could have taken him aside to ask, tell me about the hat. But I didn't. That semester I was also teaching Introduction to Women's and Gender Studies. And there we did, the students, they wanted to talk about it. So we put aside whatever we were going to talk about for the day and just talked about the election. And gave them that. That's in that class. That class I let the students have more of a guiding the conversation. So they wanted to talk about it. So we talked about it.
Yeah. I think, that was a day that lots of classes turned into a discussion about it.
Yes. Yeah.
And again, the multiple roles that professors are called on to play that we're not necessarily trained for, and that not just in that case, I remember, after 9/11, after that you are in your own kind of personal shock or grief or anger or whatever, and to have to set that aside. And that's not, again, necessarily what we're trained for, and if it's not related to what you do. What do you do with that?
The day after Trump was elected, I was in my office just crying, right? And then had wipe my tears, and then went into my classroom to okay, I've got to stay strong for the students. Right. So we really see the emotional labor that professors go through.
Right. And so that's another way about thinking about managing identity-based conflict, right? That we often think about it as something that we are facilitating among students. And again, and then we become some kind of disembodied, just brain that kind of functions in there rather than a whole person. Right.
Because the professor we have identities as well. Do we put that aside, or do we bring that with us into the classroom? Right. When is it relevant? When is it not relevant?
Yeah. So I think the pedagogy summer is going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it should be great. So I know you're also busy planning a Sociology of Reproduction mini conference right now, which is going to be part of the Eastern Sociological Society's winter meeting. So can you tell us a bit about the goals of the conference and what you're hoping will come from it?
Sure. So every year, the ESS, the Eastern Sociological Society, has our annual conference in various northeastern cities, and this year it's in Boston. And for the past several years, they've allowed different people to organize mini conferences. And so this is maybe the 6th or 7th year, I'm not sure, that a mini conference has formed around the issue of reproduction, which is my area. And so for the past 2 years, I've co-organized with a couple other sociologists. And it involves I forget what the theme of the general conference is, but we try to every year match it somewhat. So as sociologists, we focus a lot on inequality and stratification. So a number of papers deal with that, reproductive justice. It's pretty broad. There are papers on abortion and contraception, infertility, reproductive technology, pregnancy, maybe even breastfeeding. So it's pretty wide ranging. We have, I believe, 11 panels, which is huge
For a mini conference.
For a mini conference, because
huge.
there are so many scholars, not just from the northeast of the country, but from all over the country who are interested in this topic, and we'll all converge for this. So it'll be exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. So Lauren, I know one of the things you're doing while you're here at Penn is working on your new book. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. I've been working on it for several years now. So I'm loving this opportunity to have an office and a computer where I can just write. That's my only job, is to write. So the book is about how childless women make decisions about having kids or not having kids. And if they do want kids, how do they know when they're ready to have kids? How does the timing work out? Do they plan to use technology? What are the financial and relationship barriers that go into all this decision making? So that's what I'm working on right now.
That's terrific. Is there anything in particular that that in your research that's really struck you, that you're excited about being able to kind of get out there through the book?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that I'm struck by is the issue of, something I've been working in the office right now is the issue of what are known as cultural scripts, and how so many of the people I talked with talked about how it was always assumed that there was this life path that they would follow, and how it's slightly different from the paths that their mothers took. So a lot of their mothers had them in their earlier mid-20s, and a lot of the women I've been talking with are in their 30s or late 20s or early 30s. So they've already broken one pathway that most of their mothers did. But even though there's this new script for them, they want to break out of the assumption that they will become mothers and want to become mothers. But even if they do that, they're still battling with the idea that there's a certain way to be a mother, to be a parent. So all the new ways of parenting that's really intensive and having to devote so much time to your kid, the idea that you need to have a ton of money saved up before you have a kid, a really stable job, a great insurance plan, all these things now today seem like barriers to a lot of the women in my study who do want children, or those who want children maybe feel like maybe they won't ever have them, or we're just making the choice not to have them. And sort of the difference between how they're approaching motherhood versus the way that their own families and mothers did when they were younger. That the pressure seems to be, not that it wasn't that it was easy for their mothers, I'm sure it was very hard, but balancing work and family today seems to be a huge issue for many of the women that I'm talking today. Debt from all their school loans is really ramped up, and just a lot of they're just feeling really pressured today to make a decision. And then once they do make a decision, do I want a kid or not want a kid? How do I actually enact my plan? How long am I actually going to have to wait until I feel ready to have a kid? Yeah,
it's interesting because that makes me think about looping back to what we started with around reproductive justice and the ways in which women are discouraged to have children, and when the notion of being ready is really so financially based, right? So you don't necessarily have to be married, but you have to have the insurance, you have to have the money, you have to have a house, you have to have all the, be able to send them to certain kinds of schools and all of that. Who that then, which people will never be ready, right? They can never,
they will never be ready.
Or if they do it anyway, then somehow they've already started out parenting wrong.
Right. they're not that cultural script, already have veered off of it. Okay? Yeah. And a lot of the script I'm talking about is most of the women I'm talking to, they're mostly middle class and educated. The majority have at least their bachelor's, if not higher. We can see different cultural scripts with poorer women, with low-income women, with women who don't have the bachelor's degree. Mm-hmm. They're just different standards about what it takes to be ready to have a kid. Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited. I'm waiting for this book. No pressure, but I'm waiting for the book.
Thanks.
So I want to thank Lauren Jade Martin for talking with us today, and I want to thank all of you for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You've been listening to the Alice Paul Center podcast series. To listen to other episodes, please go to the Alice Paul Center website at the University of Pennsylvania.